Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is the 19th of April, 2020. I'm Roy Potter. Welcome as you come in. This is not a live stream this time. We're doing a recording because I felt that it was so important that we not get any interference. I just found out that was a joke, and I won't explain what happened. But at any rate, I want to welcome you as you come in. I have a very special guest today. He has been in the electrical generating business in the generating stations for about 40 years, and he's been an operator in there, which means he really knows his stuff, for about 15 years. So we're going to talk to him in a few minutes, but in the meantime, I just wanted to bring up a couple things. It's very important that we understand that Mike Pompeo said that just in the last few days he tweeted out that the cyber situation is very critical right now, and he warned other opponents, other enemies, not to attack us using cyber warfare. If you've been listening to Monograph, you'll remember that he has been saying that something is going to happen involving electricity. Well, that could very well be a cyber attack, or it could be an EMP attack, pulse weapon, or something like that. And the effect of that would be taking down our power systems and our communications and a lot of other things. And that's why I have Bill on today, because I want to talk about those vulnerabilities in the system. Along with that, I'm very concerned because we're seeing the continuity of government efforts in D.C. right now, and the activation of units to be used for evacuating rather, they are vacant really, evacuating the officials in D.C. from government buildings and locating them elsewhere. Something big is going on. This isn't a drill. And then, of course, the B-52s that were moved out of Guam. BP Earthwatch Jesse Waltman texted me that the other day. I actually already knew it, but I think I'll bring it up so he knows, if he's listening to this, that I did know about that. The B-52s leaving Guam, why? Because, like, they moved the aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor before the attack by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941. Do they know an attack's coming and they want to get those B-52s out of there? Or are they being moved around for other reasons? I frankly believe that it's the United States people themselves, the American people themselves, that are under attack, and I don't trust anything, of course, that is happening right now, because we are really the end objective in all this. So you need to keep yourselves fully aware of what's going on. But I don't want to get into a whole lot of politics today. I want to be able to let Bill, and that's not his real name, but we're calling him that because we were going to put him on camera, but you know, the entire thing with trying to be upfront about things can bring a lot of difficulty down on people. And I'm just grateful that he talked to me the other day and gave me these things that we're going to talk about. We talked about great things in detail, but we're going to just talk about the general stuff today, and that will be enough to blow your mind, actually. But at any rate, we need to keep ourselves fully aware, situationally aware, eyes on the horizon and ears to the ground. Okay, so let me introduce Bill. Bill, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for being with us today. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate this. And of course, as we've talked about, I thought what I'd do is just kind of generally ask you, what are the vulnerabilities in our system? And then, of course, once we finish with that, and those are just going to be surface ones. I'm sure there are some that are even more intricate and detailed, but just some surface, easy to understand things. And then we'll move to the consequences of what happens when the grid goes down. So if you would just give us kind of a little background on how the system is put together and what the vulnerabilities are.
Yes, basically the grid system, or the power line system, is what transports the electricity from the generating stations to the different regions and different areas, and then it comes down right into your house through all kinds of different transformers to transform it down to your house power. And so these grid systems are designed and with protective measures in mind to try to keep them reliable and keep them operating so that everybody has electricity. And so you have the power generating stations, which transmits the power and generates the power onto the grid, onto the power lines. And these grids are set up in regional areas like the western grid of California, Colorado, Wyoming. That's a grid system, and Arizona is a grid system. That's one grid system. Then Texas has its own grid system, which isn't a bad idea as far as I'm concerned. But then you have I think you have a Midwest grid. I'm not really sure about the eastern states. They have another grid system over there, but those grid systems are separated from each other, physically separated from each other, so that generally speaking, they're physically separated, so that you don't have interference between the grids, because different parts of the United States will have different loading requirements and for different times of the day. So say just taking the Western grid, you have lots of generating stations out there that are generating onto the grid. And so they have protective systems so that if a power line gets hit by a large lightning strike, or there's some sort of physical damage, or a power line falls down or gets burnt like they had in California, the grid system will separate itself in that area from the generating stations to try to keep the rest of the grid generating power. So the grid itself is relatively protected electronically from those types of problems. Physical damage or attack, that's a whole different situation. If somebody blows up a power line or something, then you've got a major problem in that section. So that's how the grid system works. The power plants historically had been islands. They were islands unto themselves, and there was no network connections between the generation station and the network of what we know now as the internet. And so the generating stations were dependent upon the internet. They didn't have to have the internet in order to run. And the grid didn't require the internet in order to transport the power from the generating stations to all the households or industries or whatever. But what they've done now is they've connected everything right down to the control systems in the power plants into the internet. And so what that does is that makes each power plant vulnerable to hacking from the outside. And now all the IT people will say, well, we've got these firewalls and we've got all these great firewalls. Well, as we know, in the last 10 or 15 years here, what happened to Iran with their nuclear centrifuges? Somebody hacked into their system and destroyed their electrical centrifuges. And so, I mean, the same thing could happen here. That's the problem with the cyber part of it and the internet part of it, and how we're all connected through the internet with these power plants. It makes them vulnerable to hacking.
Yeah, we saw some examples of that, of course, with the USS Fitzgerald when its electronics were cyber hacked, and it caused that collision with that Chinese freighter. So we know that China can infiltrate our military electronic defenses, so it wouldn't be surprising, of course, that they could do it against our electrical system itself,
Right. So
our power system. Yeah.
What these hackers would have to do was they would have to target individually the electrical systems. They would have to get into the internet systems and be able to target specific power plant control systems in order to hack into them and be able to control the plant remotely, essentially, and shut things down or cause a problem with overpressure in the boilers or overspeed the generators or whatever they would have to do. They would have to target specifically these power plants. Now, if they can do that, then that's a real risk. That's a problem. That's the cyber part of it. Now, the other part, of course, that we have is if you're talking about an electromagnetic pulse type explosive device or a nuclear type device, then what you have is a gigantic and almost instantaneous spike in the electromagnetic voltage that the grid itself, all the power lines and all the electronics in the power plant are exposed to that voltage spike. Okay, so not only is the cyber part of it a vulnerability with people being able to hack in and control the systems, if they were to set off an EMP that was a large enough voltage spike, then what happens is the most vulnerable component overall on the power plant is the transformers, because in the generator, they generate electricity from a lower voltage to a higher voltage in order to get it onto the power grid and onto the power lines. And so if it's a high enough voltage spike, then what happens is a generator is coils. It's like a big motor, essentially. And a transformer is coils of wire. And so that voltage spike will go right through the transformer, essentially creating a massive voltage spike in the transformer, and it punches through the insulation of the transformer. And basically the transformer will just shut itself off. And once that happens, they have to have people come out to test the transformers to make sure that they're okay, which they wouldn't be at that point. Mm-hmm. And once they find out that the transformer is bad, they can't just instantaneously replace that transformer. It takes about 1.5 to 2 years of lead time to, once you've ordered a transformer, to even get the transformer delivered to your plant site. And all of our transformers, there's not any place in the United States that builds these large step-up transformers anymore. They're all made in Mexico or Indonesia or China or wherever, South Korea. And so the lead times are 1.5 years. So once that generator is shut down because of a destroyed transformer, you got 1.5 years that particular generator is down.
That's disturbing that, of course, with this globalization and everything moving to China and other countries, that our so-called elites have done to us, that we've become this vulnerable because of this. In my estimation, it was a deliberate thing to help take down the United States, but at the very least, it was for profit. And you mentioned once before that the electrical companies are more concerned about profits than they are about security. Could you kind of address that? And in the view of the fact that these electrical systems, these power systems, are critical infrastructure, but they're not being treated as such, and possibly the reason why.
Right. So what happens with electrical generating companies? They generally are granted a monopoly for the generation of electricity in an area. And so, say that there's a regional power company. They are granted a monopoly to produce power, and we're talking about a general monopoly, not right down to the cities and stuff, because there's lots of small cities that have their own power companies, but they buy their electricity from the major generation corporations in the area. And so the Public Service Commission of the states grants a monopoly to these generating companies to produce power, and basically it's under the requirements that the power be reliable and reasonable price structures. Okay, they expect them to price it reasonably, whatever it costs them, and then they expect them to provide reliable power. Okay, and historically, these were local, regional utilities that were regulated utilities. Now, there's lots of unregulated utilities out there, and they just buy and sell power, and they generate power and sell to the highest bidder, and they're what's called merchant plants. And they're even worse as far as reliability than the major regulated utilities. The problem is that these larger corporations and these larger investment companies have bought up these regional, local utilities, and they've consolidated them into large investment company-owned regional utilities. Now, they're supposedly still under the regulation of the states, and the states treat them as a regulated utility, which gives them certain tax advantages, and it allows them to go to the Public Service Commission and say, okay, it's costing us this much to generate the power, therefore we need to charge X number of cents per kilowatt hour. The problem is that these companies, it's all about money, and because they're investment companies, all they care about, generally speaking, is money. So when you hear an ad on the TV or the radio from some local utility saying how wonderful they are and how reliable they are, you can basically assume exactly the opposite, because this is just the propaganda that they're marketing.
No.
Their marketing people are putting out for it. It's
right.
Just whatever they're saying, assume exactly the opposite when it comes to reliability, okay? Because all they care about is money. They don't fix anything until it blows up or breaks down, and then it falls into a capital expenditure category instead of a maintenance category. You see how that works in the
Right,
bookkeeping?
right. I
And
get you.
so that's where the unreliability comes in, because they just allow everything to run and don't do any preventative maintenance on it until it breaks or blows up. Literally, if it breaks or blows up, then they fix it. Otherwise, they don't fix it.
Well, this is incredible, of course, because critical infrastructure, they want to call the voting system, a critical infrastructure. But, I mean, there's some problems, of course, with voting not working probably, but it's not immediately a life or death situation. Of course, the power grid is. So this is very disturbing, very, very, very disturbing.
Right. And so the weak component in this whole system is the transformers. Like I said before, it takes 1.5 to 2 years to get a transformer. So if there's some sort of an event where they actually are able to launch and detonate some type of EMP over whatever region in the United States,
or a cyber attack.
If they were to do that, of course, it wouldn't be one EMP. It would be a multiple staged attack if they were to do that. And so it's going to take down the whole grid. And you might as well plan on the grid being down for 1.5 to 2 years before we can get all the transformers back up and running with the generators and everything else. It's not going to be very much fun. Basically, you can plan on living like it was your great-great-grandparents in 1870. That's what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and of course it'll take longer than that because society will totally self-destruct at that point, and it'll be roving bands and warring communities one against the other. I mean, it's just going to be a nightmare. And in my own personal opinion, of course, I don't want to get into too many politics here with you. I want your technical understanding, but I think that a lot of this has been orchestrated, and we've been led down this path where everything that we were self-sufficient with before has been doled out to other countries with the promise to us that, we'll just be a service economy and be able to drink martinis and sit by the swimming pool. You know what I mean? Maybe you could give us a little background on the physical security aspect of it, the lack of actual physical security at these different generating stations.
Right. The larger generating stations always have security guards, and they have fences, and they have a little bit of barbed wire at the top of the fences around the plants. But basically, the security guards there are mostly to protect the plant against its own employees. Okay, that's what they're there for. Most of the small plants don't even have any security guards, and all they have is a fence, and basically all that does is keep the cows out. There's really, in fact, no security at these plants. They have all kinds of cameras, all kinds of whatever that they've spent all this money on to record everything, but that's all after the fact. That's somebody waltzes in and tears down a fence and breaks something to make the power plant go down. That's an after the fact action with all the cameras. There's no proactive security at any of these plants. To put it bluntly, they're just not protected. And being as critical as they are to the survival in a lot of cases of the individuals that are totally dependent upon electricity, which in general, the society in the United States has become totally dependent upon the electrical systems. I mean, just turn off the power for a day and see what happens in your own home. See how dependent you are on the electrical system.
Well, I know you mentioned, as we were discussing once before, that you think that the politicians in general would protect the electrical system because they want their electricity for their own advantages. And I've pointed out that would be true if they were really honestly concerned about America and the American people. And I fear, of course, that there's a larger majority of them that have sold us out. And so I consider that the critical infrastructure of our power system is a target. I look at things from a military point of view, that it's a target just like any other logistical supply. When you go to war with someone, including your own people, whether or not that's what's going on, that's debatable with people, and I don't want to get too much into politics, but the fact of the matter is, the first thing that you attack is command and control, communications, and logistical supply lines, which would include the power system. So I'm concerned that the mere fact that they haven't addressed it as critical infrastructure and allowed this to be just a profit-making thing. It's not that I want them to nationalize these things. That's not the point. But since they're being regulated anyway, as you mentioned, then some type of cyber protection and physical security is an absolute necessity. So I know, in the military system, we have protections against, for instance, EMP attacks, but they're not foolproof by any means, but there's some degree of that there. Cyber protection, of course, they have that, which apparently, as you were saying, the power plants by and large, their firewalls really aren't that complete. At least they're at least as vulnerable as possibly the situation with the nuclear facilities, centrifuges there in Iran, and as we've pointed out with our difficulty with the USS Fitzgerald, its systems being hacked, and then they having that situation where they collided with the Chinese freighter. So we have a lot of problems, and that's why, Bill, I wanted you to come on to just kind of give us a background on how vulnerable we are. And you've already mentioned that if things go down, we're going to be in the 1870s, and people have to understand that this is going to be a major catastrophic casualty creating event. Just think about it. It's not just the food supply that'll be interrupted, and your own refrigerators that won't work. If you're using frozen items as your food supply, you got to rethink that. But it's all the different hospitals and medical situations in the homes that are powered by these electrical systems. And without that, a lot of people are going to end up in very serious circumstances. So what would you think would be your overall concern in an attack on the system, be it from a cyber attack or from an EMP or a pulse weapon of some type, as opposed, and we'll talk about the individual attacks. You've already kind of mentioned that, and that can happen. But what do you see as being problems that I haven't actually covered yet? Have I hit them all pretty well?
Well, there's the cyber aspect to it through the computer systems and the internet. That's one problem. Then you've got, if there's an EMP, that's another problem. That's kind of a separate problem, even though it affects everything. And then you've got the physical security. And then you've got a problem that they're not maintaining them properly. They're not doing periodic maintenance to make them as reliable as what they say they are doing, which they're not. And so the public service commissions are either bought off by these politicians, or else they're...
No, they don't do that.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that if the public service commission knows this and they're not doing anything about it, then basically they've failed in their charge to properly regulate the utility within the parameters of what they expect the utility to be and how reliable it's supposed to be. They're basically running these utilities as merchant plants, and everything that, like in the Western region, everything that the Rocky Mountain type generation stations, everything that those generators generate. See, California cannot generate its own power, no matter how many solar panels they put up, no matter how many wind generators they stick up. It cannot generate the bulk of the power that they require. And they're not allowing any plants, any coal plants especially, any types of plants to be built in California to supply their power. So what they're doing is they're relying on the Intermountain region to generate the power, the bulk of the power, and sometimes the Columbia River system. That's a big system up there in hydroelectric, but that's only seasonal. So they're relying on these other places to generate their power, and they're treating these systems as merchant systems based upon how much money they can make, not how reliable they are. And so they've created a system of merchant plants rather than a reliable, regulated regional utility, which just comes down to these huge investment companies owning these companies and just doing whatever at all cost in order to make more money.
So in other words, it's very similar to the selling of our manufacturing facilities, including the making of transformers to other nations under this global system. They've almost done a miniature microcosm of that with the power systems.
Yes. Everything from top to bottom is at whatever, not based on reliability. It's based on cost.
Right.
How can you reduce the cost? Well, if we buy a transformer from Indonesia, it costs us half as much or even a tenth as much as what it would cost to build in the United States. So it's all based on cost. And their periodic maintenance is based on cost. Everything's based on cost. So it's not based on reliability, even though that was the concept originally of having a regulated utility, so that they would give the utility a monopoly in order to provide reliable power. But what they've done is they've transformed that, and it's supposedly all legal. It might not be ethical, but it's all legal, into a money-driven, cost-driven utility system.
Okay. And you mentioned once before that Tesla designed this system. I know he wanted an entirely different system altogether, but he is actually the guy that created our alternating current system that allows us to use the system that we have today. And that you were saying that Thomas Edison wanted to use a DC system. Could you kind of address that as to the reason why the Tesla system was accepted?
Yes, when they started utilizing electricity as a transportable system, in other words, they were putting up power lines and transporting that electricity to the homes and the industries and the businesses and all the different things. There was two basic competitions going on, one between Tesla and Westinghouse, who Westinghouse was backing Tesla, and Thomas Edison, who wanted a DC system. And so with a DC system, because there's no alternating current, it would have to have generators every 4 or 5 blocks in order to generate the DC system out. So what Tesla and Westinghouse did, they collaborated a little bit, mostly Tesla's ideas and Tesla's designs. He created a alternating current grid system, which allowed him to transform the power from the generating station to a higher voltage onto the power lines, which allows the company, whoever's generating electricity, to transport that power long distances, hundreds of miles. You can put high voltage lines up and you can transport that electricity hundreds of miles. That's the only reason our system works as reliably, in a sense, with transportation of the electricity as it does today, is because of what Tesla designed and Westinghouse backed it.
Very interesting. So to sum up, basically what you're saying is that our system is very vulnerable, and that if it goes down for any reason, be it a cyber attack, an EMP, somebody on the ground, taking out these different stations or whatever, which I guess can be done quite easily. We won't discuss all the methods that could be done, but it's definitely not difficult. We're looking at basically reverting society back to the 1870s, basically immediately, overnight, at least locally, if not nationally. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And one more thing, I would kind of encourage people, if they think they need some sort of electricity for their lights and wheat grinders or whatever, it's not that hard to create a little system on your house. All these people that are running around selling all these solar systems, that's usually based upon a grid tie system, which means there's no storage at your house. If electricity goes off on the grid, then you have no power, even with a grid tie system. And so they're selling this as a way to supposedly beat the power company, because supposedly the power company is raising their rates every year and all this kind of stuff. And so they sell these systems based upon the subsidies that are in existence, saying that they're going to recoup their investment, whatever it is. But that system is those systems are basically a really gigantic scam based upon ignorance, because they couldn't even exist without the massive subsidies that the U.S. government is borrowing money in order to provide the subsidies for the solar systems. I have a couple of solar panels. I have a little wind generator. It goes onto my system at my house, charges my batteries, and I have an inverter. And then I have a disconnect transfer switch on my house that I can switch over to my own little local system. But realistically, I can only power my lights on a consistent basis, from day to day. If the power goes out on the grid, I can power my lights and maybe a wheat grinder or some smaller appliances, or my skill saw or something once in a while. To put a system large enough to provide your own power would probably run about $80,000 to $90,000 for one single house. So it's not practical for people to actually have their own power system. That's why electricity is provided in bulk, and that way they provide it to you as the consumer for a reasonable cost. Pricing, anywhere from 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour, all the way up to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. It's just it's relatively inexpensive, and what we're paying for power in the United States doesn't even come close to the actual cost of what it actually costs to generate the power throughout the whole system. for example, there's a couple of studies that people might want to look up. If I can mention those,
Please do.
There's a couple of studies that were done. One is called "The Unseen Costs of Wind-Generated Electricity" by the Institute of Political Economy at Utah State University. That's the unseen costs of wind-generated electricity. Another one is called "The Unseen Costs of Solar-Generated Electricity." It's put out by the Institute of Political Economy at Utah State University also. Both of these are really extensive and detailed studies on the actual cost of solar and wind generation. Just for example, the actual cost, the real cost of power at a coal-fired power plant is about $70 a megawatt hour. That's $70 for 1 million watts for 1 hour. That's the actual cost. Now, on average, the actual money that they can glean from generating that electricity is anywhere from $15 to $30 a megawatt hour. That's what the power companies get paid. Now, where's that other money? It's borrowed money that the United States government is subsidizing all forms of energy with. Okay? And so if you got $70 of actual cost and they're only charging $30 a megawatt hour, then you've got, what, $40 that's being subsidized and borrowed by the government for that generating station. That's not a sustainable model. But in this study, they did this study pretty extensively, and they said the actual cost of solar electricity is about $390 a megawatt. Okay, and that doesn't even cover the subsidies that the power companies get paid outright for taking the power. They get paid to take the solar power because it's so unreliable, and they're required by law to buy every watt that's produced by the solar power companies. So if we're not talking about a scam, I don't know what this is. This is a gigantic scam on the American public. So you got a cost of $390 a megawatt hour, plus about anywhere from $40 to $60 a megawatt hour that the government is paying these companies to take the power. So you're looking at over $390 a megawatt hour, and they're selling it for $15 to $30 a megawatt hour. That doesn't make any economic sense, and that's what these studies talk about.
No, definitely not. I didn't even realize that aspect of this entire problem. What do you think I don't even know what the solution to that would be. I mean, obviously, we're getting rid of the so-called sustainable or renewable power, but is there any way to reverse this problem with the generating station power?
Well, I'm not a financial person. I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not a bookkeeper. I'm not an accountant or anything like that. But it doesn't seem to make sense to me to have a cost of $300 a megawatt hour if you're only selling it for $15 to $30 a megawatt hour. What they really need to do is they need to gradually, over time, charge the American public and industry what it actually costs for the power. They need to do that. They really need to over a period of 10 or 15 years or whatever, they need to reduce the subsidies out and actually start charging what it actually costs to generate the power. Right. Otherwise, this model is not sustainable, and our great-great-great-grandkids are going to be paying for this and not being able to pay it off.
Gee, that sounds like the stimulus we just had, right? Same kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, where does the government get this money? Right. Well, that just shows
whether it works or not.
Right, and that just shows again that we're dealing with a critical infrastructure that has been ignored for the sake of profits, and worse, that the ability to sustain that system with the technology and the equipment that's needed has also been farmed out. Another reason being cost, of course, but I look at it as being a political problem as well, that it was deliberate. So basically what you're saying, again, as we've stated several times, is that this is an area that we're extremely vulnerable in, and that if there is going to be a problem, as Pompeo has said, that it's very likely that it's going to attack these systems. That's probably what we're looking at initially. And I was talking about this back in 2010, 11, somewhere in there, about the problem with especially the EMP, and I understood the cyber problems as well. But regardless, this critical infrastructure has been ignored, and much to the detriment of our liberty and security, both, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the biggest threat, I think, is an EMP, because if you have an EMP, that will affect the entire grid system and the generation systems. That's the biggest threat. Physical threats, yeah, that's kind of a problem, but unless it's as a massive terrorist attack or something, then
It'd be more localized, at
that's more
least.
localized.
Right.
Yes.
So what do you think
So
people can do? You've mentioned, having like the system that you have. Is there a lot of people aren't going to be able to even afford, a $4,000 system. And
no, first of all, I think a good idea, if you're capable of doing it. I mean, if you have medical equipment that you're depending on and you have to have it on, then obviously you can't turn the power off.
right.
But I would just turn the power off for a day or two and just see what happens. Just see how you think when there's no power. Just because you don't know what to do about it until you're actually in it, in this situation, because the American people, or the world in general, and developed countries, they've become so dependent upon the electrical system, and rightly so. It's cheap, it's easy, it's convenient. It's nice to throw your clothes into a washing machine and open your refrigerator to get your pop or your beer or whatever you want out of it. It's so nice and convenient, and it's easy. It's cheap too. But the reason it's cheap is because the government essentially has socialized it over the last probably 40 or 50 years, subsidized it to the point where the companies are still making a profit. Don't get me wrong, they're making a profit. But the government is subsidizing that profit and socialized it essentially. So there's ways to if you need power, a couple of solar panels, some golf cart batteries, those are probably the cheapest, most reliable ones. An inverter, get somebody that knows something about electricity to help you, and you can set up a small little system that can be essentially, if the power is turned off, you just go out and turn off the switch to your house. And then you can set it up to where you can power your house, at least lights and a wheat grinder or some smaller essential stuff, so that you don't have to burn coal oil lamps or propane lamps or whatever. It's not a really very hard thing to do, and it's not that expensive. I mean, for probably $2,000 or $3,000, and then that's a lot of money for some people, I know. But for $2,000 or $3,000, you could have a really nice system to power your lights, and it would generate its own electricity with the solar panels. I'm not against solar panels. I'm not against wind generation. It works really well. But on a national grid basis, to actually supply power to our major power producers, it's not practical, it's not economical, and it's totally unreliable. The dispatchers and the people that control how the generations are generated and everything, they hate it because it's totally unreliable. Small systems on your house or a cabin or something like that, they work really well, and they're quite reliable. Now, along with that, I mean, anytime you have an electronic device, if you have an EMP problem, an EMP attack, then that device is just as vulnerable to that EMP as any other electronic device. So EMP is, if it's very close, it's probably going to take down your inverter, and then you wouldn't have AC power in your house anyway. But I still have a system. I have solar panels, I have a wind generator, and it works very well. It works really well. If I can just go out and turn off my transfer switch and power up my house, I can't power the refrigerator, I can't power the heating system, stuff like that. But it works well for lights and my wheat grinder and whatever else we need for just basic functioning in the house,
Right.
as far as lights and stuff.
Right. Having a redundant number of systems is, like in an aircraft, it has redundant systems. So in case one fails, another one kicks in. Those are very important. Backup systems, if you can afford them. Security in depth is another way of looking at it. Well, Bill, I appreciate you coming on. I don't want to keep you much longer. I'll give you probably a couple more minutes. If you have anything that's outstanding that you'd like to cover that you haven't, please feel free to do that.
Well, it's a problem. It really is. I'm concerned about it. I've been concerned about it for a long time. I mean, the newer plants that they're building, they're trying to harden them against EMP. I mean, these newer plants that they're building, every single beam that goes to the ground is grounded to a massive ground grid. Okay, and that's their attempt to try to shunt all of this high voltage to the ground. And so they're attempting to protect these newer plants that they're building by doing this. This is more of an electrical theory in a sense, but to shunt this voltage to the ground rather than having it go through the control systems. So that's a good attempt, but if it's very close or if it's very much of an EMP, that even that's not going to prevent that from happening. So it's a problem. It really is. And I don't think these regulators and these public service commissions realize, at least they haven't ever been told, because usually they bring in an expert. And who do they bring in? The power company.
Right.
That wants to make money. Okay, Mr. Power Company person, how are we supposed to protect our grid? Oh, we're protecting our grid. We're protecting it, and it's reliable, and we're doing everything we can. Well, like I said before, whatever the power company says is it's marketing. They're marketing this power, and they want to make the most profit for the least cost.
So that really shows us where we are. Well, thank you, Bill, for taking the time. Actually, you had to. I'm going to tell the audience here, we had to do this twice because the camera messed up the first time. And being a one-man show, which I am, I wasn't aware that it had a problem. So Bill was kind enough to do the interview over again. And you have a lot of patience, Bill. God bless you.
No problem at all. No problem.
All right. Well, thank you again. And if you folks will hang on for just a minute, I'm going to finish up and give you a few more pieces of information. Again, Bill, thanks. You have a wonderful day.
Hey, you too. Thanks a lot.
All right, bye-bye.
Best wishes for everybody.
All right, so there he goes. He was very kind to do that. We actually have been talking about this prior to this, of course, because of my concern over what we're seeing. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what to say. I think that as far as the American people are concerned, this is their Achilles heel. And a lot of you know that. You've researched it, studied it for a number of years. And I don't really remember what the numbers are, but I know that if the electrical system did go down and put us back in the 1800s, that it's going to cause mass casualties over a period of time. Some immediately and some over a period of time. So you have to have some redundant measures, some security in depth, some contingency plans, and so please do that. So I'll just end on, as usual, I told you what we were going to talk about, then told you, and now I'm going to tell you what we talked about. And what we talked about is the vulnerability of our electrical systems, our generating systems, our entire electrical grid, that it is very vulnerable. It is our Achilles heel, that the replacement parts, especially for the transformers, but other equipment for our grid, are not made in the United States. So if they go down, whether one or many, we have to look to whom? China, Mexico, Indonesia, and South Korea. You can see what the problem is. And then, of course, you have to talk about logistical supply lines to get those replacements here in the time it takes. So this is a very dangerous thing. It hasn't been handled as critical infrastructure. They've actually just kind of ignored it. And they did it because, in my estimation, the senators really aren't concerned about turning their lights on and off. They've been concerned about their overseas investments and not the security and the liberty of the United States and the American people. Finally, I will end on the Wuhan virus, and that is that there is, in fact, more and more evidence to show that this entire thing, not that the virus isn't real, as you always hear the caveats, but that it's being used to take down our liberties and to imprison us. And further than that, as well, we're hearing doctors now saying that this is a problem of hypoxia, that something is robbing the cells of the ability to use oxygen because of the lack of oxygen, and that's what they're seeing as developing in patients. And of course, the mainstream media and the powers that be are doing everything to counter the actual observations of clinical and treatment doctors on the ground. So, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot excuse President Trump for allowing what's happened to happen. Again, as Mark Pantano has said and Chris Ann Hall, he can't have... it's a federalist system, at least it was supposed to be. But in my estimation at this point, of course, they're using the federalist system against us. So the only remedy now, and I don't think Trump is willing to do it, obviously, because he's still keeping Fauci and Bricks and Gates and all of that with what I've talked about with the vaccine dangers and all that. He's allowing the governors with some what would I call theatrical threats at this point, false cheerleading, whatever, that they have to get in line with protecting the American people and their rights. Well, this phase system that they're bringing in is nothing more than kicking the can down the road. And the National Command Authority, the president, all those people, I don't trust them. I don't. So make sure that you are making your preparations and understand that the show, as Monograph says, the show must go on. And unfortunately, the curtain isn't going to close on those that are providing the show. They want to close the curtain on us. God bless you. Prep, pray, stay out of the way. Keep your situational awareness on high. And keep your eyes on the horizon, your ears to the ground. And God bless you and all of yours. And I hope you got some information in this program that will help you to understand the difficulties, the dangers, and the way to prepare yourselves. Okay? All right, until next time, out for now.